Let's Destroy Work, Let's Destroy the Economy. Written by Alfredo M. Bonnano. First part, Introduction. Written by Jean Weir. The old work ethic has disappeared along with the massive, obsolete structures of capital, which required a permanent army of producers. Yet work still has far more implications than mere survival. Millions of people still compete for the privilege of turning up day after day, year after year, to surrender body and soul in exchange for a wage. The alternative? To encounter one's real desires and create the means required to realize them, could present some surprises and lead to undreamed choices. A job, boring or arduous as it might be, is the easy way out. It gives structure to our day and puts order in our expectations, giving us just enough in our pockets to acquire instant sublimation and quell any sudden surge of hatred towards what is stealing our time and our lives. The pernicious mixture of hatred and dependency at the basis of the work relationship atrophies the individual, reducing life to a question of accountancy, quote-unquote free time, a mere negative quantity ranging from a few hours between days at work to months or even years between jobs, can be survived by performing a number of rituals. Shopping, watching TV, doing voluntary work, or going on adventure holidays to faraway places can fill gaps and prevent any feelings of anguish which might lead to putting the whole setup in question. If all else fails, capital's white-coated auxiliaries are always on hand to prescribe the latest psychotropic fix tailored to produce a dim glow of indifference. Technological, quote, progress once deformed human beings into ragged, starving laborers, still a reality for the millions who produce the global economy's primary requirements, then into skilled workers with access to consumer goods, and now uprooted, flexible, quote, human resources with access to McDonald's, flex time, credit cards, even a mortgage and shares in the company. The essence of this new slavery is that life itself has been mortgaged to the interests of capital. Anyone harboring doubts about the ethics of this reality can find solace in some of its, quote, alternative manifestations. Voluntary work, quote, alternative banks, and, quote, self-managed enterprises now exist alongside famine, genocide, and the destruction of the planet, all equally indispensable components of post-industrial capital. Remunerated non-work, dole, dismissal production of social peace is also a job and an essential part of this whole system, where the increase in, quote, free time, always obscured by the shadow of work, is tainted with restricted freedom of movement, lack of money, and status. Even robbing banks or reappropriating goods remains within the logic of capital, if the individual perpetrator of the deed does not already have their own project in motion. The appropriation of our lives, our time, our space, once snatched here and there through sabotage and absenteeism, now requires the invention of a new creative project starting from the destruction of work, both subjectively and objectively. We need time to reflect on what we want to do with our lives, and space to find the necessary means to bring this about, through both individual and collective experimentation. Life unbridled and in a adventure into the absolute other requires the total destruction not only of, quote, my work, but of the very concept of work and economy as the basis of human relations. Now, if we eliminate work as a reality, it follows that we implicitly reject the industrial working class as a privileged component in the revolutionary struggle against exploitation and domestication. Reduced in number, abandoned by the unions, and dismembered as a class due to mobility and the new technologies, the survivors are prey into devious forms of control of their actions and their minds. Access to credit and consumerism have also played their part in constructing the anteroom of existential redundancy for the proletariat. Along with the disappearance of the working class as a defining force in the struggle against capital, we are also witnessing the disappearance of the concept of the crisis, once considered to be a precise moment in the future where economic collapse and disorder were to herald in the revolution. There was the belief, even among many anarchists, that one day this would occur. It was only a question of time, so all that we had to do was to spread anarchist ideas and propaganda whilst awaiting the great event. We now know that crises do not exist, not because the world is in perfect order, but because, on the contrary, it is in complete disorder. And if capital is surviving by adapting to the chaos of economic reality, we cannot talk about programming or economic, quote, laws, or think of the class struggle as something that has, quote, less alternative phases. There are moments of greater or lesser intensity in the struggle between exploiters and the exploited, but there is no way to measure expectation. We must conclude that the time is always ripe for attack. It is only the means we choose and the surrounding conditions that change. A closer look at such questions can enhance our destructive project and give it focus. In fact, the analyses presented here in the form of a collection of essays were originally a contribution to the lively debate that was going on in Italy at the time that they were written. The leading article, quote, "Let's Destroy Work," was first produced in leaflet form as a contribution to an eponymous meeting in Turin, which was attended by many anarchists from Italy and beyond. We see in this first analysis how in the recent past the struggle against work was contained within the parameters of capital, where workers stole time from the bosses inside the factory. Alternative forms of production were also experimented, and attempts at self-management were the order of the day. However, everyone acted within the quantitative dimension, remaining enclosed within the restrictive work environment. The new technologies are now causing the disintegration of the old worker identity, and many of the strategies once applied by workers in the struggle against their conditions are being implemented by the bosses themselves. The discourse must therefore turn itself against work to become a qualitative, destructive project for the immediate transformation of life. Mere doing will then give way to free action, where everything is yet to be invented and experimented. The supporting articles, which tackle aspects of the present economy mentioned above, give considerable insight and help to demystify these new forms. It is therefore my conviction that the following analyses deserve careful consideration, and I am well aware that this will require a certain effort due to their complexity, unaided by the limitations of translation. Nevertheless, the effort could well be rewarded with the acquisition of greater clarity, especially concerning areas of activity which claim to be, quote, alternative choices and merely serve to confuse the issue. There can no longer be room for doubt concerning the question of work. It is time to joyously begin to destroy the copse in our heads, along with everything else that revolts us, recklessly making and breaking our own rules in the urgent task of demolition. Written by Jane Weir. Chapter 1. Let's Destroy Work. Work is a subject that is coming back into fashion in a big way in newspapers, academic lectures, papal sermons, electoral speeches, and even articles and pamphlets produced by anarchists. The main questions raised are: what can we do about growing unemployment? How can we give meaning to lost professionalism in jobs that are undergoing the effects of neo-industrial development? What alternatives can be found to replace traditional work? And finally, and this is the way many anarchists think, how can we abolish work or reduce it to the indispensable minimum? Let us make it clear right away that none of these problems interest us. We are not concerned with the political problems of those who see unemployment as a danger to democracy and order. We do not feel any nostalgia for lost professionalism. We are even less interested in elaborating libertarian alternatives to grim factory work or intellectual labor, which are unwittingly doing nothing but toe the line of the advanced post-industrial project. Nor are we for the abolition of work, or its reduction to the minimal required for a meaningful, happy life. Behind all there is always the hand of those who want to regulate our lives, think for us, or politely suggest that we think as they do. We are for the destruction of work, and, as we will try to demonstrate, that is quite a different matter. But let us proceed in an orderly fashion. The post-industrial society, which we will come to later, has resolved the problem of unemployment, at least within certain limits, by dispersing the workforce into flexible sectors which are easy to maneuver and control. In actual fact, the social threat of growing unemployment is more theoretical than practical, and is being used as a political deterrent to dissuade wide social strata from attempting to organize in ways that might question the choices of neoliberalism, especially at an international level. So precisely because workers are much easier to control when they are skilled and attached to the workplace with career prospects in the production unit, there is insistence everywhere, even among the ecclesiastical hierarchies, on the need to give people work and thereby reduce unemployment. Not because the latter constitutes a risk from the point of view of production, but because the danger could come from precisely that flexibility which is now indispensable to the organization of production today. The fact that the worker has been robbed of a precise identity could lead to social disintegration, making control more difficult in the medium term. That is what all the institutional fuss about unemployment is really about. In the same way, the productive process no longer requires a high level of professional training, at least for the majority of workers. The need for skilled labor has been replaced by a demand for flexibility, that is, an adaptability to do tasks that are constantly being changed, and willingness to move from one firm to the other. In short, they must adapt to a life of change in accordance with the boss's needs. This is now being programmed from school onwards, where the institutional cultural elements that once constituted the basic technical knowledge from which the world of work built real professionalism are no longer provided. Not that there is no longer a need for high level of professionalism, but this now only applies to a few thousand individuals who are trained in postgraduate courses, often funded by the big companies themselves in their attempt to secure people suitable for indoctrination and conditioning. Until recently, the world of work was permeated with an iron discipline, the assembly line, strict controls by white-collar workers, to the point of secret files and sacking for any deviation from the norm. Holding on to a job meant submission, acquiring a military-style mentality, learning procedures that were sometimes complex, sometimes simple, and applying them, identifying with them. It meant considering one's life, one's whole way of life and everything that mattered in the world, including one's ideas and social relations, to be summed up in them. The worker spent most of his time in the factory, made friends with his workmates, talked about problems at work during his time off. He used recreational facilities provided by the company, and when the holidays came round, he ended up going away with his workmates and their families. To complete the picture, the large companies held social events and organized periodical outings to bring families together. Their children went to the same schools, and one of them usually inherited his father's job when he retired. In this way, work went full circle, affecting not only the worker's whole personality, but also that of his family, thereby creating complete identification with the company. Just think of the tens of thousands of Fiat workers in Turin who supported the Juventus football team owned by Fiat boss Agnelli, for example. This world has now disappeared for good. Even though some residue of it still exists, most of it has disappeared along with its projectual uniformity. A provisional, uncertain work relationship has replaced it. Insecurity about the future is a fundamental element, and lack of skill means the lack of a base on which to plan one's life as a worker, now left with no project beyond earning enough to make ends meet or pay a mortgage. In the past, escape from work took the form of searching for alternative ways of producing so as to reappropriate the creativity extorted by the capitalist mechanism. The model applied was the refusal of discipline and sabotage of the production lines in order to slow down the work pace and get time off, even if only minutes, free from alienation. In this way, the time stolen from meticulous factory supervision had a value as something alternative. Just for a moment, one breathed free from the prison-like atmosphere of the factory or the office. As we can see, such a world has almost ceased to exist, and will go further along this road in the near future. More than that, the old conditions did not differ all that much from the primitive factory structures, the textile works set up with the British capital that had been accumulated over 2 centuries of piracy, where the workforce, fleeing from the English and Scottish countryside, literally came to be enclosed en masse. But under these conditions, the taste of regained time was soon poisoned by the inability to give it any meaning beyond the work environment. In other words, time was regained in terms of reducing physical fatigue, not because one had the knowledge or desire to do something different. And this was also due to the fact that one had become part of one's job, espoused to it for life. Even the revolutionary theories of anarcho-syndicalism did not contradict this basic condition. Instead, they gave it a libertarian qualification, giving the syndicalist organization the task of building the free society of the future, starting off from the work categories that already existed. So, up until a few years ago, this was published a while back, abolishing work simply meant reducing fatigue, creating enjoyable alternative work, or, in the most advanced, in some ways most utopian and fanciful instances, substituting it with a game, an absorbing game with its own rules capable of giving the individual an identity as a player. One might argue that the game as a logical category has gone far beyond the regulated version, like chess, and taken to its logical conclusion as ludic individual behavior, play as the expression of the senses, as eroticism or sexuality, or free self-expression in the field of gesture, manual dexterity, art, thought, or all these elements put together. This had already been theorized, of course, starting with Fourier's genial intuition, similar to Bentham's theory that the pursuit of personal interest indirectly and involuntarily leads to greater collective interest. The fact that the good traveling salesman Fourier made a treasure of his individual experience in order to weave an incredible web of social relations based on affinity is not devoid of interest. Nevertheless, none of that escapes the essential rules of work seen in terms of the global organization of control, even if it is not exactly production in the capitalist sense of the word. So we see that work cannot be abolished progressively. We need to approach the problem in a destructive manner. Let us see why. In the first place, capitalism itself has now dismantled its obsolete apparatus, at the same time depriving the individual worker of his identity as such. It has made him, quote, alternative, without realizing it, and is now preparing to plant in him all the seeds of the external aspects of formal freedom. Freedom of speech and in ways of dressing, a variety of jobs to choose from, not much intellectual effort, standardized safety procedures explained in simple manuals, a slowing down of the work pace, robotization of basic procedures, progressive separation between the different aspects of work, all going towards building a different model which does not correspond to that of the past. To insist on reappropriating stolen time implies inventing a unit of measure along with all of the other discretional units relative to the suspension of work, a notion which the worker would have difficulty grasping. Rather than acquire the capacity to envisage a project that is an alternative to working for a third party, he could develop a growing feeling of panic. The fact that far less work is necessary than that required to earn a living wage has already been clearly illustrated by revolutionary theoreticians in the past. This analysis is now being used by post-industrial capital itself, and is often brought up in conferences and meetings concerning the restructuring of production. A reduction in labor would mean reducing work to the minimum required to produce only what is useful. We cannot accept this theory today, as it is now being considered by capital itself. Only the time frame within which this is to come about differs, whereas nothing is said about the methods that would be used. To struggle for a reduction in working hours, even a considerable one of, say, 20 hours a week, means nothing in revolutionary terms, as it would do no more than open the way to solving some of capital's problems, certainly not lead to the liberation of all. Unemployment as an element of pressure, no matter how slight now that it is finding a considerable outlet in the numerous versions of marginal work, seems to be the only factor pushing capitalist production to look for solutions to reduce working hours at the moment. But in a not too distant future, the need to reduce production might become a reason for reducing working hours, especially since international military equilibrium no longer depends on two opposing superpowers. Voluntary work, about which little has been said, although it is a question that deserves all our attention, acts as a safety valve which could, among other things, provide a solution to the problem of reducing working hours without having to worry about how the masses, relieved of a control of a third of their day, might spend their new-found free time. So we see that unemployment is no longer the most serious crisis capital is having to face today, but it is still one that is constitutionally linked to it. It can become inconstitutionalized, then recuperated as the projectual use of free time by the same companies and structures created for this purpose. So post-industrial capitalism is a homogeneous system within which the concept of a crisis in unemployment no longer exists, the latter having become one of the alternatives of the productive process itself. The, quote, alternative ideal of a life based on the art of, quote, getting by is also disappearing. Small-scale handicrafts, little self-produced undertakings, the street selling of objects, the necklaces, infinite human tragedies have unrolled in dingy, airless shops over the past 20 years. Much really revolutionary strength has been trapped in illusions that required not a normal amount of work, but super-exploitation, all the greater because it was tied to the individual's will to keep things going and show that it was possible to do without the factory. Now, with the restructuring of capital and the new conditions resulting from it, we can see how this, quote, alternative model is exactly what it is being suggested at an institutional level to get through this moment. As always, they see the way the wind is blowing. Other potentially revolutionary forces are now shutting themselves up in electronic laboratories and burdening themselves with work in dark, stuffy little premises, demonstrating that capital has won over them yet again. If we were to sum up the problem in a simple formula, we could say that if work once gave a social identity, that of the worker to be exact, which, along with that of the citizen, came to form the perfect subject. Any escape from that was a truly revolutionary attempt to break out of this suffocation. Today, where capital no longer gives the worker a specific social identity, but tries to use him in a generic, differentiated way, with no prospects and no future, the only struggle left against work is that of destroying it, thus procuring one's own projectuality, one's own future, and a new social identity in opposition to the attempts of annihilation put into action by post-industrial capital. Most of the strategies that self-aware workers have used over the past decades against brutal, immediate exploitation, about which hundreds of pages could be written, have now become normal procedures for capital itself. It is capital that is now suggesting, when it does not impose, the breaking up of work units, reduced flexible hours, self-defined projects, participation in decision-making, deciding on particular aspects of production, autonomous work islands that become each other's customers, quality competition in everything else. All the paraphernalia taking the place of the old monolithic uniformity of work has now reached levels that are no longer controllable by individual conscience in the narrow sense of the word. That is to say, the single worker is constantly faced with the possibility of being pulled into a trap where he ends up bartering for his own combativeness, now only potential, in exchange for a few concessions. And if these were once self-determined, and could be considered part of the great movement of struggle against work, today being conceded, they are simply another aspect of work, moreover the one that contains most characteristics of recuperation and control. If we are to play with our lives, and during our lives, we must learn how to do so and set the rules of the game ourselves, doing it in such a way that these are clear to us and incomprehensible labyrinths to others. We cannot just say that a game with rules is still work, which is so, as we have already said, and that if the games are abandoned, the game becomes free, therefore libertarian. The absence of rules is not synonymous with freedom. Rules that are imposed through control and sanctions are slavery, and work has been this, and could never be anything else, for all the reasons we have just seen, and all those we have forgotten to mention. But the absence of rules could become a different, perhaps worse, form of tyranny. If free agreement is a rule, I intend to follow it, and I expect others, my comrades in the agreement, to follow it too, especially when it concerns the game of my life, and my life is at stake. The absence of rules would leave me in the clutches of the tyranny of uncertainty, which might provide a thrilling dose of adrenaline today, but might not agree with me in the future, or rather certainly won't agree with me. Furthermore, freely chosen rules not only build my identity, my being with others, but also my individual knowledge of myself and my desire to open up to others, to live in a world populated with other free, vitally free beings capable of deciding for themselves. All the more so at a time when there is a move towards the illusory freedom of the absence of rigid rules, at least in the world of production. In order not to be taken in by reduced, flexible working hours and exotic paid vacations, or to be beguiled by wage increases, early pensioning, or free financing of individual enterprises, it is necessary to devise one's own project for the destruction of work. It is not sufficient to simply limit the damage. Here, a few ideas that seem to have seen their day have become topical again. A mentality cannot be destroyed. In fact, the professional mentality, as expressed even in party and trade union organizations, including the anarcho-syndicalist forms, cannot be destroyed from the outside, not even by sabotage. When sabotage was used, it was only as a means to intimidate the bosses, a hint of something beyond the strike, a way of making it known that one was more determined than others, but was nevertheless ready to suspend the attack as soon as the claim was accepted. But sabotage is still destructive. It does not affect profit indirectly, like the strike, but hits the structure directly, either the means of production or the end product. It makes no difference. That means that it acts beyond the work situation. It does not strike to obtain something specific, but also, and I would say principally, to destroy. And the object to be destroyed, although it is property, is still work when you think about it, as it concerns something that has been obtained through work, whether it be the means of production or the finished product. We can now understand the horror many workers once felt before acts of sabotage. Here I mean workers whose lives of total dependence had given them a social identity that could not easily be eradicated. I have seen men in tears in front of their factory after it had been attacked and partly destroyed, because they saw a considerable part of their own lives also being attacked and destroyed. And that life, poor and miserable as it might have been, was the only one they had, the only one they had any experience of. Of course, in order to attack, one must have a project, an identity that has been worked out projectually, an idea of what one wants to do, even, perhaps all the more so when one considers this to be a game and lives it like a game. And sabotage is a fascinating game, but it cannot be the only game that one wants to play. We must have a multitude of games at our disposal, games that are varied and often in contrast with each other, aimed at avoiding the monotony of the rules, becoming just another boring, repetitive job. Making love is also a game, but you can't play it from morning till night without banalizing it, without feeling wrapped up in a drowsiness which, although it gives a pleasurable sensation of well-being, also dulls us, makes us feel useless. Taking money from where it is to be found is also a game, one that has its own rules and which could degenerate into professionalism as an end in itself, thereby becoming a full-time job with everything that implies. But it is an interesting and useful game if seen in the perspective of a mature consciousness which refuses to fall into the contradictions of a consumerism that is forever ready to swallow up what one has managed to snatch from the economy as a whole. Once again, it is necessary to overcome the moral barriers that have built into us. It is necessary to put ourselves beyond the problem. Reaching out and taking others' property is something that is full of risks, even for a revolutionary. Not just legal risks in the narrow sense of the word, but in the first place, moral ones. Clarity on this question is important, as it is a question of overcoming the same obstacles that made the old worker shed tears in front of the damaged factory. The idea that property is sacred has been instilled in us since birth, and it is not easy to free ourselves from it. We prefer to prostitute ourselves to a boss for a lifetime, but have a clear conscience at the end of the day. We feel we have done our duty and contributed in our own small way to producing the national income, which naturally ends up in the outstretched hands of the politicians with the nation's destiny in mind, who got rid of any scruples about taking what we have accumulated with fatigue long ago. But the essential part of any project to destroy work is creativity taken to the maximum possible degree. What could we do with all the money of all the banks we were able to rob put together, if the only thing we can think of doing is buying a fast car, a big house, going to nightclubs, or filling our lives with thousands of useless needs and boring ourselves to death until the time comes to rob the next bank? That is something many of the bank robbers I have met in prisons systematically do. If all the comrades who have never had any money in their lives think this is the way to satisfy some of their whims, let them go ahead. They will find the same disillusion as they would in any other kind of job that is perhaps less remunerative in the short term, but is certainly less dangerous in the long run. To imagine the refusal of work to be no more than the listless acceptance of non activity is a result of the mistaken idea that work slaves have about those who have never worked in their lives. The latter, the so called privileged from birth, the heirs to the great fortunes, are nearly always, indefatigable workers who dedicate all their strength and imagination to exploiting others and accumulating even more wealth and prestige than they already have. Even if we were to limit ourselves to the great squanderers of inheritances that the tabloid gossip columns take great pains to portray, we would still have to admit that this horrible race are also eternally busy at their daily grind, occupied by their tedious social relations or by fears of falling victim to aggression or kidnapping. This is also work, carried out according to all the rules of obligatory activity. It becomes a true job, where the boss of these exploiters is often their own lust or fear. But I do not think many of us can consider the refusal of work simply to be an acceptance of the deadly boredom of doing nothing, while we keep on the lookout for traps set by others who might try to convince us to do something through solicitations or flattery, perhaps in the name of an ideal, or personal affection or friendship, or who knows what other devilry capable of threatening our condition or complete inertia. Such a situation will be pointless. On the contrary, I think that the refusal of work can be seen in the first place as a desire to do what one enjoys most. That is to say, of transforming obligatory doing into free action. I wrote a long article about this many years ago in Pantagruel, which is still valid today in many respects. But this condition, free action, is not mapped out once and for all. It is not part of a situation that exists beyond ourselves, nor does it rain down on us like an inheritance or the spoils of a ransacked bank. Such incidents could be an occasion, an accident, sought or not, desired or not, to enhance a project that is already in course. It is certainly not the condition that determines it or carries it out. If we have no project in terms of life, projectuality in the full meaning of the word, no amount of money will ever set free us from the need to work, to be doing at all costs, pushed by a new kind of necessity, not poverty this time, but boredom, or to acquire social status. The dilemma can only be resolved by inventing one's own creative project, or, to put it differently, by reflecting upon what one wants to do with one's life and finding the necessary means to realize it without working. If we want to destroy work, we must build roads of individual and collective experimentation, which take no account of work except to cancel it from the reality of what is possible.